So, the ambivalence can be seen in paragraph 37, and the Wootton Committee there are not restricting the use of community service, and basically, in terms of whether you agree with this assessment, in terms of the ambivalence in the proposal, it's useful to read some more of the report, and paragraph 33 is a good example of how this approach of currying favour with different people was an approach adopted by community service. So, for example, when you're looking at the middle of this paragraph, community service should appeal to adherents, supporters of different varieties of penal philosophy. To some, it would simply be a more constructive and cheaper alternative to short sentences of imprisonment. By others, it would be seen as introducing into the penal system a new dimension with an emphasis on reparation to the community, whereas others would regard it as a means of giving effect to the old adage that the punishment should fit the crime, whereas others would stress the value of bringing offenders into close touch with those members of the community who are most in need of help and support. So basically, in terms of whether supporters or people who believe in, say, retribution, or people who support rehabilitation, or people who support reparation, there's all something in it. They've all got some kind of substance in which they could support it. So basically, there's something in it for everyone as a result of the currying favour approach. Now, it is a significant paragraph. It has been quoted word for word, and it is important to realise that the retribution, the rehabilitation, the reparation, all goes to show that the sentence had a lack of a clear rationale. And you'll see that Baroness Wootton, the chair of the Wootton Committee, admitted that this was a deliberate course of action. It was an undisguised attempt to curry favour with everybody. So that was, was their kind of approach. Now, it did then help people buy into the idea of this new way of doing justice in this sense, and as I say, the ambivalence meant that it appealed to conflicting philosophies. Whatever people's philosophies, there was some substance in community service where they could support this. Now, this kind of lack of a rationale, this lack of clarity, has something that arguably has something that's affected community service entire time. Possibly the result that it is such a wide and such a broad proposal could be the reason why in just 18 months it acquired legislative approval, which is quite amazing really, that normally things take a lot longer than that. And but community service was quickly through into legislation. Now, what also began happening around this time is, see there at the top of the page, the proposal began to be toughened up. The maximum number of hours were doubled, opposed to what Wootton had originally produced. There was fear of it being seen as a soft option. And there was, as I say, the desire to toughen it up. Now, in terms of toughen it up, we can see there, sort of halfway down the page, that for some MPs this toughening up wasn't enough, and you can see there that quote from Tony Vass, which I think is a good example of what we've spoken about before, in that punitive ideals, punitiveness isn't something that's just restricted to the 1990s, as there in the early 1970s. It's hard to believe now, but an MP was calling for every criminal and his family to be sent to the islands off the Western Highlands of Scotland. So now in terms of the public perception of community service, it's important to note that there is evidence for a number of years now that show that the public are familiar now with community service. So going back a few years now, what Julian Roberts found that it is well known with the general public, but also it's important to know that it was relatively well received. So despite this new dimension, a new method of punishment, that the public were generally supportive. Now, it appears that the public were more of the opinion that it was an alternative to a prison sentence, and that's what community service was being used for. So the actual reality that it was being an alternative to fines and other non-custodial sentences didn't appear to reach the public confidence, and so for that reason, public awareness, the public may have had a different role for community service in the sense that they saw it as a high tariff measure rather than the courts, who saw it as a measure that could be given in a whole range of different circumstances. Now, in terms of evaluation of the proposal, it's clear that, it needs to be pointed out that the evaluation that was done in 1976 by Ken Pease and others, this research limited itself to just practicalities. So in other words, was it practical and was it feasible for the probation service to administer this sentence? So it wasn't research that addressed whether community service met its primary aim and produced change in behaviour of offenders in terms of reconvictions or other evidence of change. The research was just limited just to practicalities. Now, on top of this, the political interference with the research of community service was also noted later on, in that the research team who were evaluating the first schemes in community service, the first pilot schemes, they were told that their evaluation report had to be ready on the day that the government were announcing the scheme was going to be extended. So as the government had already made their mind up, regardless of the research of the pilot schemes, then I think that shows quite a lot about what the government thought about the value of research. So with that reflective question in your lecture notes, please give it a bit of time so you think about these pressures and the limited value that research actually had. So the confusion in the scheme wasn't addressed by research, and unfortunately, as it says there, it was disappointing that more emphasis on what type of offender should receive the sentence was not addressed. Unfortunately, no kind of it was very difficult to find evidence as to why certain offenders were being selected for community service and why others weren't. So, in terms of the research behind community service, it was an example. I mean, Roger Hood was quoted as saying that the problem with community service was not necessarily the idea itself, but the lack of criminological research in order to how it might work, for what types of offenders it might be suitable, and so on. So again, there's a clear lack of research in that. Hood goes on to say, that there was no coherent, no justification in terms of a coherent analysis of crime, criminal behaviour, or the effects of penalties. In other words, the part played by criminological analysis, theory, and research was minimal. So the enthusiasm that the Wootton Committee had, this idea that offenders would benefit from working alongside volunteers, unfortunately did not have evidence to support it. So there were these inconsistencies, and in terms of the first orders, I think this is just is an example of the whole kind of confusion. The first person to receive community service was, according to the press and the public, was a chap called Peter Giles, And if you're reading there what Ken Pease had to say about Peter Giles, then this paragraph here might explain as to why the media was so keen to pick him as an example. But it became clear that despite the government wanting community service to be a high tariff measure, it was seen as quite a low tariff measure. Now, the views of the probation service were important because, as you can see there, they had a high level of influence on community service compared to other sentences. So basically, the probation service had to confirm that the defendant was a suitable type of person to undertake community service. And in terms of their input into the sentence, that's important because they do have a high level of influence as found by these authors there. So, in some ways the community service was a failure, the initial thing was a failure because it wasn't used for cases that would otherwise incur a custodial sentence. So, having said that there were confusion, the sentences were quite in favour of community service because, as the paragraph at the bottom of page 20 illustrates, quite quickly it became a very popular sentence. Popular in the sense of the numbers of orders that were imposed. And you can see at the top of page 21 that the courts were quite in favour of this very, very broad discretion they've got as to when community service can be imposed and when it can't. So the government facilitated such beliefs, arguably, in that they didn't limit community service via Acts of Parliament. Instead, they did it through Home Office memorandums, which sentencers could choose to discount if they felt appropriate. Sentencers only have to follow Acts of Parliament. Executive memorandums is something, matters of policy, that they don't have to follow. Now, in terms of where community service was going to go, the last thing for this session is to see that despite the fact that it was popular in the 1970s, it was something that did cause quite a lot of confusion. There were some general similarities that evolved out of the statistics, but there was a lot of uncertainty. Ken Pease in 1980 then wrote some futures for what he imagined community service would go, in terms of, first of all, bureaucratisation, and in this it was felt that financial considerations would shape what community service would actually be. So it would value the economic worth of community service as the most important thing, and this free labour would then enable local authorities to shape it in ways that they would like to. Now, these financial appeal was emphasised by Pease, who in many ways kind of exaggerated this, but I mean, in quite a forceful way, that the courts were keen to give CS to anybody with a full complement of limbs who appears before a court. So slight exaggeration there, but it shows the enthusiasm that courts had for imposing community service. He also then wrote about probationisation and penalisation. With probationisation, it was basically felt that looking at CS in terms of basically just an extension of general probation work, and basically taking quite a dim view of the work of probation officers, in the fact that, if offenders are absent, then it's largely ignored, and presence is credited by doubling the number of hours worked, and basically making the task more of a form of probation rather than community service. He finally talked about penalisation in sense of it becoming a more punitive kind of approach, and then standardisation was a final thing, whereby instead of having local kind of approaches, it would be dealt with on a national kind of approach, and as it says there, the offences which the standard replaced would be defined nationally, the suitability of work projects will be defined nationally, there'll be on-site inspections, and basically just a general kind of standardised kind of approach. Overall, these different cameos didn't suggest a particularly rosy future. but for some reason, optimism and confidence was retained.